Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today is the day we can finally present our review of Nvidia's new RTX 3080. This review is coming out a couple of days later than we initially thought, but don't worry, everything you need to know is going to be revealed in this video. So I don't really want to spend too much time on the introduction, going over some of the specs, the Ampere architecture features, that kind of thing. A lot of that stuff we've already covered, and a lot of it is all going to be in the written article over on kitguru.net. But in this video, we're really kind of focusing on just how fast is this graphics card. So really, to get straight into it then, to benchmark this card, we used our custom-built system provided by PC Specialist, consisting of an overclocked i9-10900K at 5.1 GHz across all cores. That is paired with an ASUS ROG Maximus 12 Hero Wi-Fi motherboard, as well as 32GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR4 memory. If you're hearing that and wondering, well, what about PCIe 4? Don't worry, we are going to have an entire video dedicated to testing just that coming very, very soon. All of the graphics cards you're going to see as comparison data in this video were completely retested from fresh. So for Nvidia, we used the 452.06 driver, and for AMD we use the Adrenalin 20.8.2 driver. Now for the 3080, Nvidia did provide a press driver to us, so that was the 456.16 driver. The last thing to say just before we do dive straight into those benchmarks is that in this video we are going to be focusing on the 1440p and 4K resolutions, which I really do think are the most relevant for a GPU of this caliber. However, we did also test 1080p, so if you do want to see those benchmarks, head over to the written article on kitguru.net. So that is really it. That's all the key information I think you need to know right now. And with that said, let's get straight into the game benchmarks. So our first game of the day is Remedy's Control, and I would say this is arguably the game with the best RTX implementation that we saw over the last 2 years, and it was also among the first to feature DLSS 2.0. The RTX 3080 dishes out some significant beatings to the 20 series in this title, outperforming the RTX 2080 by 64% at 1440p, while it is also 32% faster than the RTX 2080 Ti at the same resolution. Up at 4K though, those margins only increase in the 3080's favour. With the increase in resolution, its lead over the 2080 Ti grows to 37%, while it is a huge 79% faster than the RTX 2080. This is certainly a fast start for the 3080. Next up is Death Stranding from Hideo Kojima. Frame rates are exceedingly high in this game, and the 3080 takes that to the next level. At 1440p, this Ampere GPU is 28% faster than the 2080 Ti, 50% faster than the 2080 Super, and 55% faster than the RTX 2080, so some really significant gains. Bumping up the resolution to 4K once again brings out the best from the 3080, where we see an average frame rate of over 100 FPS, and that works out as a 35% increase over last generation's GeForce flagship, and a 68% lead versus the RTX 2080. Now, The Division 2 is actually the game where we saw the biggest gen-on-gen increases for the RTX 3080, which personally I do find slightly amusing considering it is actually an AMD title. Still, at 1440p, the 3080 produces 141 FPS on average, which is a huge gain of 72% over the RTX 2080, while it also works out 32% faster than the 2080 Ti. It's at 4K where we see the biggest gains, however, as the 3080 is not far away from double the performance of the RTX 2080, producing 76 frames per second on average versus 42 frames per second from the 2080. It's a hugely impressive performance leap, also equating to 38% more performance than the 2080 Ti. Moving on, Far Cry New Dawn definitely paints a different picture, but that's really just because this game is bottleneck city. Even at 1440p, we are definitely CPU limited with the RTX 3080, as the GPU comes in just 7% faster than the RTX 2080 Ti, so a fair amount less than the other games we've already tested. Even at 4K, the margins aren't as large as we have already seen, or will see, from the other games on test, with the 3080 beating out the 2080 by 55%. Considering that's actually the smallest gen-on-gen increase of all the games we tested, I think that probably tells us a lot about the overall performance of this card. Gears 5 now is actually another AMD title, but Nvidia cards still occupy the top half of the chart. At 1440p, the RTX 3080 delivers over 120 frames per second on average, which is another 31% increase over the 2080 Ti, while it's also 57% ahead of the 2080. We are really seeing the 3080 do best at 4K though, and that is no different in Gears, with the card's relative performance lead over the 2080 increasing to 67% as we bump up the resolution. Versus the RTX 2080 Ti, it's a 34% performance gain for the 3080. Ghost Recon Breakpoint is another game where the 3080 doesn't scale quite as well at the lower resolutions as we have seen from some other titles. At 1440p for instance, it's 19% faster than the 2080 Ti and 49% ahead of the RTX 2080. Of course, these are still highly impressive numbers, there's no denying it, but it's not as high as something like Gears 5 or The Division 2. At 4K though, where we are entirely GPU limited, those relative performance numbers do pick back up. Here, the RTX 3080 is 32% faster than the 2080 Ti and 67% faster than the 2080. Next up is Metro Exodus, and here we see some exceptionally high frame rates with the RTX 3080, as we average almost 180 FPS at 1440p, which is an increase of 28% over the 2080 Ti. Even at 4K, this card is still pushing 100 FPS on average, working out as a 69% performance improvement versus the RTX 2080. Moving on to Middle-earth Shadow of War now. Despite being nearly 3 years old, this is still a pretty intensive DX11 title. Even then, the RTX 3080 continues its strong performance, averaging 125 FPS at 1440p with a 54% performance lead over the RTX 2080. At 4K, that lead again grows to 65% versus the 2080, while the 3080 notches up another victory over the 2080 Ti, this time to the tune of 29%. As for Red Dead Redemption 2, this is actually a game we had a number of requests for, so we duly obliged, even though it is a bit of a pain to benchmark. We test using high settings, and at 1440p, the RTX 3080 is 24% faster than the 2080 Ti, and compared to the RTX 2080, it's an improvement of 60%. Once more, those margins of victory for the RTX 3080 increase at 4K, where the card is 29% faster than the 2080 Ti and 68% faster than the RTX 2080. Our penultimate game of the day is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and this was one of the first games to be announced with RTX features. Here, the 3080 solidifies its position as top dog, beating out the 2080 Ti by 27% at 1440p. Things only get better as we move to 4K, as the Ampere GPU is 33% faster than the 2080 Ti, while it also takes a 69% lead over the RTX 2080. Finally, we come to Total War Saga Troy. Like Ghost Recon Breakpoint, I do suspect CPU bottlenecking comes into play here, as even at 1440p, we're not quite seeing the same scaling as our other titles, as we see the 3080 take a 20% lead over the 2080 Ti. It's still a very healthy improvement, yes, but we have seen better. Even at 4K, the jump over the 2080 Ti works out at 26%, so this is a slightly below average improvement over the last generation's flagship, at least based on the rest of the games we tested. When compared to the 2080, the RTX 3080 comes in 61% faster at 4K. So then guys, that is it. Those are the performance numbers. It is safe to say the 3080 is a bit of a beast. Averaged over our 11 games, we can see the 3080 comes in, on average, 31% faster than the 2080 Ti, 58% faster than the 2080 Super, and 68% faster than the 2080, all at 4K. 4K, I think, certainly is the best resolution for the 3080, or at least that's where we see the biggest relative performance increases. But even at 1440p, this new GPU is 55% faster than the 2080 and 25% faster than the 2080 Ti, neither of which are small improvements. So far though, everything we've talked about has been in terms of the traditional raster performance of the GPU. But what about ray tracing? Well, performance improvements to the RT cores means relative scaling is slightly higher compared to the 2080 Ti when ray tracing is on. Both the RTX 2080 Ti and RTX 3080 feature 68 RT cores, and while the Ampere GPU does benefit from its increased CUDA core count, we can still see the 3080 doing slightly better in control, relatively speaking at least, when RT is turned on. At 1440p for instance, the RTX 3080 is 36% faster than the 2080 Ti with RT set to high. With RT off, the 3080 is 32% faster. We can also see a marginally smaller performance hit when turning on the ray tracing effects, as frame rate drops by 40% for the RTX 3080 and 42% for the RTX 2080 Ti. That being said, considering the fact the 3080 is significantly faster than the 2080 Ti, it can get away with the frame rate drop a lot better than the previous generation flagship could. We also retested Metro Exodus, and this game does see better performance scaling when RT is turned on, at least compared to Control. At 1440p, the 3080 is 43% faster than the 2080 Ti, with ray tracing effects set to Ultra, while the difference between the two GPUs is only 28% with RT turned off. At 4K, the 3080 increases its lead with RT on to 45% over the 2080 Ti. The gain for the 3080 when RT turned off is 30%, so definitely a bigger improvement when RT is turned on. The last game we retested for ray tracing is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and here we set those ray trace shadows to ultra quality. Again, we do see slightly better scaling against the 2080 Ti than when RT is off. At 1440p for instance, the 3080 comes in 33% faster than the 2080 Ti once the ray tracing is enabled. If we disable ray tracing, however, the difference between those two GPUs shrinks to 27%. As for 4K, here the 3080 does outperform the 2080 Ti by 36% when RT is on, compared to 33% when RT is off. Overall, in terms of the ray tracing abilities of the new GPU, it is quite hard to identify just how much of the increased performance comes from the improvements to the RT cores versus how much of it is down to simply having way more FP32 cores than Turing. What we can see though is average improvements between 30 and 40% with RT on compared to the 2080 Ti. And again, as we said, since the GPU is so much faster than the 2080 Ti anyway, it can afford much better to deal with a loss in frame rates than the 2080 Ti could. Whether or not this interests you, it really is personal preference, but safe to say the 3080 is a much more capable GPU than the 2080 Ti when it comes to enabling ray tracing. Moving away from raw performance of the card now, something I do want to talk about is VRAM. We've heard a few concerns from people in the community questioning whether 10GB is enough for the 3080 and particularly wondering about 8GB for the 3070. We can't really talk about the 3070 just yet, but for the 3080 I did think it would be worth going through all the games we tested and seeing what the reported VRAM usage is and whether or not that would give us an insight to any potential limitations. I will throw in the slight disclaimer that applications such as GPU-Z and MSI Afterburner will only show the requested amount of VRAM, not actual VRAM usage. So that does mean it's not an exact science finding out how much VRAM a game is actually using. A number of titles have been known to simply request as much VRAM as possible, which doesn't equate to exact VRAM usage. Still, I thought it would be worth looking at, so we'll look at VRAM usage at 4K. Here, the numbers certainly are interesting. I would disregard the Division 2 as that game was requesting up to 9GB of VRAM even when sitting in the settings menu. So for me that is certainly a case of the game just making sure it doesn't run out of memory by requesting pretty much everything that was available. Other than that, considering this is a 10GB card, in 7 of the games we tested at 4K, we actually saw requested VRAM remain below 8GB, and titles like Metro Exodus and Red Dead Redemption 2 barely needed more than 5GB. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is an example of a game that did want a lot of VRAM, but again it is hard to say whether or not this game actually needs this much memory, or it is simply requesting that much. As of right now guys, I really don't think the 10GB of memory is going to be an issue, and as we've already shown, relative performance of the 3080 is actually highest at 4K when compared to the 2080 Ti, despite that card having an extra gigabyte of memory. It's also just really hard to say when we might be running into issues. This is only something we can find out by continually testing new games as they come out at 4K. I can certainly understand the concern, especially if you know you're planning to have this card as your 4K gaming GPU for the next 5 years or so. It is very possible we will run into limitations down the line. But like I said, all we can really talk about is performance right now, and 10GB is not an issue. Moving on though, it is time to look at some testing specific to the new Founders Edition design. And we'll start with average clock speed under load, which we measure over 30 minutes of 3D Mark time spy. Here, Ampere doesn't appear to have changed anything really compared to Turing in terms of the boost clock behaviour. GPU boost will still push clock speed well above its rated boost clock before settling down as temperature increases, and these adjustments still happen in steps of 15 MHz. As for the actual speed of our RTX 3080, it's boosting to pretty much the same levels as the last gen Founders Editions. It may not be exactly as fast. The 2080 Super, for instance, was clocked particularly aggressively out of the box, but considering the rated boost clock is lower at 1710 MHz, the average frequency just shy of 1860 MHz is good to see. Next up, we come to thermal performance, and again, this is very consistent. We see temperatures increase for about the first 5 minutes of our stress test before the GPU hit 76 degrees, and it basically spent the rest of the stress test at that temperature. This puts actual GPU temperatures again pretty much in line with the 20 series Founders Editions. So the new design for the 30 series isn't radically reducing temperatures, but do remember it is also dealing with a 320 watt card, which is 70 watts more than even the 2080 Ti. It's a similar story for noise as well. Here we measured total noise output at 39 decibels from a distance of 30 centimeters, and that was with both fans spinning at 1880 RPM, so that was purely default behavior. This is once more pretty much in line with the last generation's Founders Editions, although it is actually 3 dBA quieter than the 2080 Ti. Again, considering this card is dealing with significantly more power, the fact that it's actually not really any louder than the previous generation of cards, I do think is particularly impressive. Finally, we come to power draw, and here I think it's really no surprise to see the 3080 sitting top of the pile. That's because we saw total system power draw coming in about 70 watts higher than the 2080 Ti, or about 110 watts higher than the RTX 2080. This is definitely to be expected considering the GPU's total graphics power is rated at 320 watts, making it the highest for any single GPU that I can remember. Ultimately, I'm not really sure that many people will be too bothered about this. It's certainly not a situation that we saw with the 1080, which was both significantly faster than the 980 Ti while also drawing less power. Then again, like I said, I just don't think that many people will care. Gamers were going to look at the relative performance increases compared to the previous generation and say, yep, as long as my average frame rate is significantly higher, which it is, I don't really care, and honestly, I do think that is fair enough. Right then, we are drawing to the end of this video, but the absolute last thing I want to cover is overclocking. Here, in terms of actually adjusting the core frequency, not much really seems to have changed compared to Turing. You bump the frequency as far as you can go until you crash or get instability. Unfortunately, my sample didn't overclock that well. I could only add an extra 60 MHz to the GPU core before we started getting crashes. However, it is the memory I really want to talk about here, as the behaviour here has changed compared to Turing. With Turing, you could again push the memory slider until basically you would get memory artifacting or crashes. So in some cases we would see 800, 900, 1000 MHz offsets and performance would be absolutely fine. With the new Ampere GPUs though, what Nvidia has done is if you push an overclock too far, instead of getting instability or artifacting, instead we'll actually get reduced performance. So what this means is it's now very important to verify that your overclocks are actually resulting in increased frame rates, as it would be very easy to dial in a 1200 MHz memory offset and be happy that it's not crashed and think, great, my overclock's stable, but you've probably crippled your frame rates. To illustrate this for you guys, what we did was we went back and retested 3 of our games at 4K, but with the memory overclocked at different intervals using steps of 100 MHz. With my particular Founders Edition card, the trend is very clear to see. Once we moved past a 900 MHz memory offset, performance started dropping. Now, once we hit 1000 MHz on the memory, it wasn't like performance tanked straight away, but we did see frame rates come down slightly. Again, once we pushed it to 1100 MHz, performance dropped a fair bit more, and then at 1200 MHz, we'd more than halved our frame rates. With our best results taken from these 3 games, actual performance increases were between 7 and 8% at 4K. So then that is it guys. We've looked at overall performance, we've looked at ray tracing, we've looked at overclocking, we've looked at VRAM, and we've looked at the new Founders Edition, and it is now time to wrap up. In a nutshell, the RTX 3080 is a stunning return to form for Nvidia, delivering those massive gen-on-gen performance increases that we simply didn't see with Turing. Remember, the RTX 3080 comes in 68% faster than the 2080 at 4K and 31% faster than the 2080 Ti. Ray tracing improvements are good, sure, but I really think it is those improvements to traditional raster performance which is what's going to excite people. Remember, this is a GPU that's almost half the price of the 2080 Ti, yet it's 31% faster. That is what's going to really excite gamers, and that's going to be what makes people go out and buy one of these Ampere GPUs. I have to say I'm also really keen on the new Founders Edition design as well. I think it looks fantastic, and while it may not be, cooler or quieter than the previous generation, the fact that it actually can maintain those levels while also dealing with significantly more heat, I think is a testament to Nvidia's engineering. And again, it's not even that big of a card. However, it will be fascinating to see what the AIBs like ASUS, Gigabyte MSI can do, and there's really not long to wait on that. The only other thing I want to say before finally finishing up here is, what about AMD Big Navi? I think if the rumours about the 3080 supply are true, the end of October probably isn't that long to wait and see what AMD has up its sleeve. Even then, the fact that the 3080 is as good as it is, it's an absolutely fantastic GPU, means we are going to need to see some real competition from AMD. And if that happens, it's only going to benefit gamers. So that really is it for our review, guys. If you liked it, toss me a thumbs up, leave a comment down below. What do you think of this new graphics card? I know I am pretty blown away with the performance gains we have seen here, but do let me know your thoughts. While you're there, please ding that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and you can also check out our Patreon, which is linked in the description below. And if you sign up, you can get some extra perks like seeing some of our videos early, and you also get access to some exclusive competitions. With all that said though guys, I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to go and have a lie down. But I've been Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.